You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast, your digital resource for the latest insight and analysis on all things property in the northwest of England.
Hello and welcome to the Place Northwest podcast. I'm your host, Dan Whelan. Today's episode is sponsored by Muse Developments. Muse is one of the UK's leading names in mixed-use development and urban regeneration, with a range of major commercial and residential schemes across the country. With more than 30 years' experience in delivering high-quality places and spaces where people can live, work and relax, Muse Developments is well placed in repurposing areas to bring sustainable, transformational change to towns and cities. For more information, email info@musedevelopments.com or visit www.musedevelopments.com. Today we're going to talk about town centre regeneration and public-private sector partnerships. Joining me are Phil Mayall, Board Director at Regeneration Specialist Muse Developments, and Mark Robinson, Chair of the High Streets Taskforce. Phil, we'll start with you. Muse is involved in several regeneration projects in the Northwest, Warrington, Blackpool, Salford, to name a few, and also further afield across the UK. Could you tell us what town centre regeneration means at the moment and why it's so relevant right now?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I think you're correct in saying that we're involved, in many schemes across the UK, and what that actually tells us is there isn't one kind of generic approach to town centre regeneration. There isn't a town centre regeneration means, because you have to look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunity sets, SWOT analysis of each individual location. What's needed in one location will be completely different to another location. So I suppose in the sense what it means is really understanding what a town centre really needs to progress. But there certainly isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to town centre regeneration. But what I will say is it's an incredibly exciting time to be working in the sector, because with change comes opportunity, and it's certainly we're in a period of change.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, what's driving the town centre regeneration agenda at the moment, those changes that Phil mentioned? There's an obvious one that I can think of, beginning with the letter C, but maybe you can go into a bit more detail about what's really driving this.
COVID has had a massive effect, but really it hasn't changed anything. But what it has made is 10 years worth of change happen in 12 months. So I think a lot of these structural changes in the retail market would have happened anyway, but it would have taken longer. Phil touched upon this. What the problem with our retail places, our town centres, is they became retail places. And thriving town centres used to be about all sorts of different uses. But because retail was worth so much before the internet, it drove out all the other uses. So I think there's an exciting opportunity, but it's going to be pretty tough in the short term. Yeah,
absolutely. And it's interesting, like you said, everywhere was the same previously. You could drop into any town centre across the country and you wouldn't necessarily know where you were, because there'd be no distinctive...
The curse of the clone town. So nobody loved these clone towns, so we shouldn't really be shedding too many tears over their demise, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess the plan going forward for companies like Muse is to avoid that cookie cutter, one size fits all approach that you mentioned before, Phil.
I keep saying it, but it goes back to what's the purpose, what's the future, what's the strength of that town, not as it has been for the last 30, 40, 50 years, which is, has it got enough room to expand the retail offer, as Mark says, to the detriment of everything else. If you think about it, our towns and cities have been in a state of flux for centuries. That's what makes them actually really interesting places. And this is just another, evolution of our towns and city centres. You'll have to look at some of the locations which, in some of our biggest cities, Manchester, for example, where it depopulated. If you think about it, at the turn of the 20th century, it was an absolute thriving place in terms of commerce, of people living, working, leisure. It then shifted to a place pretty much driven by retail, with a bit of leisure of an evening and pub landlords and caretakers living there. Well, the very people that would spend the money during the day were all driven out, and it only take this structural shift to then destabilize that, and we need people back, and that's again, I think that's what's going to really drive the future. And I think people tend to again jump to a one-size-fits-all solution to this, which says, well, it'll be more residential. Well, that's actually probably just repeating the mistake if it was all retail. What it actually is a bit of everything.
Yeah, Phil,
that's what makes it a vibrant place.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, somebody asked me on a webinar the other day, what does a successful high street look like in 5 years' time? And I said, a successful high street in the 2020s is going to look an awful lot like the 1920s. And a really good example of that I can think of in the Northwest is in Stretford, where Burntwood and the council are, demolishing a big chunk of that mall to literally put back in place King Street, which was the old-fashioned high street of Stretford town centre. So they really are in every way going back to the future there, and that's one of the commonalities. But as you say, there's no one-size-fits-all solution at all, Phil.
Who is it for then? Town centre regeneration? Is it for young people? Is it for older people? It must be really hard to repurpose a high street or a town centre to accommodate everybody. How do you go about doing that?
Well, I think the successful places will embrace the entire community. Again, this idea of a sort of a monosyllabic way of living in the town centre, it's got to be mixed uses. It's got to have families. Later living is a perfect case for town centre living. For the last 30 years, we've put our old folks away on the edge of town in, developments on the edge of town, which aren't anywhere near public transport. I mean, my parents are looking to downsize. They're fitting well. They've got more cash than they ever thought they'd have, and they want to live in a town centre, so dad doesn't have to drive anymore, so you can go to the pub and walk home. And they're the guys who are going to actually populate town centres, and they have the money to spend, and they like local services as well as a part. But mixed in with that, you need families, and obviously we need young people and students, and we need to have a sort of way where it's not just balkanized, where they can all live together in a way which, like we used to.
Invariably, the market generally has its failures, but it also can point to some trends, and because things start to happen naturally, and then it's about spotting that and accelerating it. And we put me straight in mind then, as Mark was describing. We were it would be about 6 years ago. We were in the Vimto Gardens development on Chapel Street, Salford, which you could class as a city centre location. One of the apartments, it was up for an award, so it was an RICS award, and the RICS asked if they could go around one of the apartments and have a look. And this lady was kind enough to open the doors for us, and the judge said, "So where did you move from?" And she said, "Oh, a farm in North Yorkshire." And she didn't have a Salford accent, so it wasn't like she'd moved out and then moved back. So what was all that about with this? Already, I think they'd had a shock that it was a middle-aged lady rather than a student who'd opened the door. And she said, "Well, why would I want to be? We've finished work, so why would I want to be stuck there?" And she walked us to a balcony, and she pointed across Key Street, and she said, "There's the theatre, the Royal Exchange over there. If I wave my hand across here, I'm waving across about 30 different restaurants and bars, and why would I want to be stuck in North Yorkshire?" And and that's no slight on North Yorkshire, by the way. It's more the farm. Why wouldn't I want to be in a town centre? And that's before anybody started this conversation. So that was already starting to happen.
Dan, it's a really interesting question. Who is it for? But it is for everybody. Everybody has an acute sense of belonging and a sense of place. And I think Phil said earlier, maybe COVID has made people feel even more closely enmeshed in their local community. And a lot of local communities really need this investment because, if you've got a knackered town centre, if you've got a high street on its knees, it affects everything. It affects how people feel about themselves. It affects jobs. It affects whether people will relocate businesses to that town centre. It'll affect house prices. It's all bound up in this sense of place. And sense of place is centred sometimes around a football club, but more often than not around a town centre. And if you can make people feel better about their town centre, you lift the whole community. It's that elemental.
Yeah. I think the interesting thing there as well, Mark, is that this is a once in a kind of multi-generation, I think, opportunity for local authorities, is the vast majority of them have had to intervene, Stretford being an example, have had to intervene and buy the local shopping centre because of the straits that they got into in terms of receivership or whatever. Now, by the nature of what they'd become, they cover a large part of a town centre. So by acquiring it, they suddenly control, as well as their own civic estate, a huge amount of the land in the town centre. So they can actually make meaningful change, rather than what would happen before, where they would tinker and get involved on the edges, but couldn't really drive real change. So it is, and as Mark says, that allows them actually to change a huge amount, just not a bit, but it's about identity, and it's that word relevant again. People will only associate with something that means something to them and is relevant to them. And I think that's what, there's going to be a real focus on.
Okay, I'm going to slightly disagree with you. You mentioned the word earlier, I think purpose rather than relevance. Relevance strikes me as something that might come and go, whereas you speak to the purpose of a place, it's more inbred in the long-term nature of it. It's an interesting point you pick up on local authorities. Obviously, they're getting quite a lot of criticism for doing that, but I do agree with you. In many cases, they are the fundamental player who has that long-term interest in the revival of place, and they're going to have to pick up the challenge. But they can't be the only people to do that. The High Street Taskforce is just part of the government response to this problem. You've got the Future High Street Fund, you've got the Towns Fund, you've got the Levelling Up Fund, and that's proper money. You'd lay it all end to end, it's about £8 billion, and that's a lot of money. That's more money than the government has ever put into high streets. But at the same time, it's not nearly enough. I agree with Phil. It's unprecedented, the challenge, but also unprecedented the opportunity that the public and private sector have. I think one thing, the mighty Muse certainly couldn't be criticised of this, but one of the things I feel that the private sector hasn't got their head around the opportunity yet. If £8 billion is going in from the public sector, plus all local authorities individually, what opportunity is that going to generate for the private sector to put money in alongside? It's huge. Plus, if you're an architect, a QS, or any of those other great property professions, there's a multi-billion-pound opportunity for you there as well. And I think as we come out of COVID, even the private sector is just sort of only just getting their heads around the huge opportunity that's going to be in this space.
You're listening to the Place Northwest podcast. The subplot is Place Northwest's new weekly supplement of stimulating analysis that adds a probing and incisive voice to our news coverage, getting behind the headlines and examining the issues affecting the industry, from politics and finance to market trends and more. Every stone turned, every angle explored, every Tuesday morning. Subscribe to the subplot for free at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe.
Absolutely. We mentioned there two words, relevance and purpose, and we've spoken about how each place is different, and it's important to create that sense of identity that's relevant to the particular place. So Phil, I was wondering if you'd be able to talk us through two of Muse's projects and talk about the differences between them. I'll let you choose which ones you want to talk about, but two that had different challenges and have delivered different results and different end products.
Yeah, I think that's again a really good way of kind of posing it, really. So if I start with Warrington, so Warrington Times Square was a first example, one of the first. Look, this is gut feel rather than fact driven, but gut feel is probably one of the first examples of an authority acquiring a tired old shopping centre that was actually detracting from its economy, causing problems, a very wet-led drinking culture in that part of town, which was limiting the sorts of mixed use we've just been talking around in terms of different generations enjoying the town centre. And through quirk of planning, was, albeit it's in the town centre, very much felt divorced. What we did there, working with Warrington, is we repurposed the shopping centre was demolished. It had bits of peripheral retail in it, and had a very old-fashioned and dilapidated market. Now that's a really interesting point in itself, because the natural question that was asked at the time was, well, we'd love a Mackie Mare type offer, as we get, every time every local authority we go to says we want one of those. What you want is something that's relevant to Warrington, and that was actually a proper market, so serving all the sorts of stuff you'd expect. So it's actually in a building that you wanted to dwell in, but it was connected to elements of a food hall, so that was serviced, and is serviced in part by the traders themselves. So there's a relevance. But what it did was it drove footfall from 11 in the morning then till 10 at night. That was sat alongside a new civic building for the new town hall, which provided footfall, which in turn was sat alongside family-driven leisure. And the public realm provides a real connection point back into the town centre. So all of that has then helped counter the wet-led drinking culture, which is actually affecting the local authorities' bottom line in terms of the social problems that resulted.
Yeah, it's really interesting that's something that you look into. I don't know. I think a lot of people maybe think it's quite simplistic, and they do think it's a one-size-fits-all. But you're looking at social issues as well, and how that physical regeneration can help solve those sorts of problems.
Yeah, I think regeneration stopped being about bricks and mortar years ago. Years ago, one, because if that's all it was about, frankly, the values. Because don't forget, there's a reason they need regenerating. So the values, more often than not, will not be the business purpose as such. But actually, this idea that you just kind of launch some bricks and mortar to a place and disappear, one, won't make it successful, and two, you will never be invited back. So it stopped being about that. Bricks and mortar actually probably the last part that you worry about. What you look at is, in your relationship with the authorities, how you can add value across the piece. So that's not just business rates. It's not just additional council tax and what have you. It's actually what's the impact on that authority as well, in terms of its balance sheet, its P&L. If it's council taxes are having to pay extra precepts in police because they've got more social issues in the town centre, well, that's causing all sorts of problems. If their social services department is so much larger because of the issues that come with it, that causes all sorts of problems. If air pollution, because there's too much traffic. So you've got to look at all of those things, not just what's the rent and what's the yield. A separate example, and one that I always turn to, is the work we've done in Chapel Street in Salford, which actually to many people isn't a town centre, but it actually is a city centre, but it's actually the traditional city centre of Salford. Now, its structural problems weren't and aren't connected with retail, because frankly that disappeared when that area of the city depopulated through the slum clearances and then the removal of the civic functions of town hall and what have you. So that was actually developing something, what we called a kind of modern high street, one that is again very relevant to that location. So independent restaurants and what have you. And I don't mean that in the sense of, again, what's becoming in some respects a one size fits all. It's actually the things that were there will help serve the local community and really stitch that back in. And that was about providing a whole range of different residential offers, from townhouses to larger sized apartments to really good sized shop units on the ground floor, and changing the public realm and the placemaking. And again, that had a massive impact on the city's bottom line. It dealt with a lot of air pollution coming through. It's still quite high, but dealt with a lot of air pollution coming down the Chapel Street area of the A6. It increased business rate revenue. It increased council tax revenue. The local school that was slated for closure has expanded so much that it's actually run out of space to expand anymore. The local primary school. Now, the answer to some, the answer might have been to stick a Mackie Mare at both of them, and that's that was just wrong solution for either of them.
Yeah, it's interesting. Two councils with two different approaches. Mark, from the outside, looking at those two examples, what are your thoughts? And another question: what can councils do in terms of working with the High Streets Taskforce to bring forward this kind of regeneration?
Here's a reflection. It's interesting you talk about Mackie Maze, which is absolutely fantastic. But as Phil says, every town now wants one, and I just wonder whether there's enough bearded hipsters out there who want to run a burger stall selling a burger for 15 quid a pop. I just don't think there's enough out there. Maybe we need some bearded hipster university courses just to fill all of these food halls we're supposed to be creating all over the place. I don't know. What's the task force doing? Well, we've got four main things we've been charged with government to do, which are all feeding into this agenda. One is to help build expertise in local placemaking. Secondly is to build capacity. Thirdly is to promote collaboration, because actually there's a lot of good stuff going on, but you need to get the people talking to each other. And then lastly, but by no means least, is the spread of information through training, best practice, information, dashboards. So you put all those things into the mix, I think you're going to help local places get there more quickly. They can look to the examples of what's going well, other than Altrincham and its food market, perhaps. You can look at other models which are going to work in different places. So we don't end up with one size fits all. But in a very practical way, the task force announced, I think 2 weeks ago, we announced the first 70 local authority, where we are going to be parachuting in a team of experts. We've got 150 placemaking experts that have been selected that are going to be deployed in the initial 70 places. And if I'd done my homework, I would have told you which ones in the Northwest they're going to be, but unfortunately I can assure you there are plenty. And the idea is they're going to go and have an incept day, find out what they're doing, find out what the weaknesses are, and then come back and do further workshop. Because sometimes it's just a matter of illustrating the art of the possible to people. There's a lot of good going on, there's a lot of enthusiasm, especially driven by COVID. I know we've spoken about that, but we've got to almost educate people on the art of the possible. And the other thing we haven't mentioned, and it's not strictly the remit of the task force, but the difference is great leadership. And I'm sure Phil will be able to speak to this as well. Leadership is what makes the change happen. The task force can put in place all of the building blocks. We can put in place the expertise. We can help with the capacity, but it needs somebody to stand up and be counted and take that really tough decision to buy that neglected shopping centre, that tough decision to resource the regeneration team within the council with people who aren't going to provide a return for 2 or 3 years whilst the development happens. So leadership is key, but again, people to be inspired to be that leader, and it might be a politician, and it might be a local civic leader, and it might be the CEO of the council. They've got to know what the art of the possible is, and that's very much what the task force is there to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's important to have that long-term vision as well, and the patience and the willingness to sort of bide your time and wait for results. Phil, what would you say to a local authority leader who in their town had a big hulking old 1970s shopping centre with high vacancy rates? What would you say to them?
I'd say, first of all, that there were probably 2 steps down the line if they were kind of thinking about that first. I think what I would, and it partly goes to Mark's point, which was an excellent one. It goes to leadership itself, and leadership in the sense of knowing and crystallising what the vision is, and a well thought out and well explained vision is for the town centre. And I would expect that, and for the borough, because actually you can't do it in isolation, because the whole point of, in my view, is one of the points of town centre regeneration is it's an opportunity to create a big bang. So it's not, if you just think about it in the confines of a shopping centre, or indeed, a town centre ward, or then you're missing the point. It's actually how much of a ripple effect can you create out into the communities, because that'll draw them back in again. So that's one thing. Like I say, I think whether or not they need to worry about the great 70s kind of shopping centre with the vacancy rate is a step down the line. The first is what is the future of my town centre? What's the future purpose of it? How do I make it relevant to my community? And that may then involve them saying, well, actually, this is a once in a kind of generation, multi-generation opportunity to intervene and actually take control and be a long-term stakeholder. What I would always encourage them to do And it goes to Mark's other point around resource, is to take in as much advice and contrary opinions as they can possibly get. Because again, otherwise we'll just move to another type of one size fits all town centre. So go out and speak and discuss and understand. There's all sorts of cliches you can chuck in here. You don't know what you don't know. Is one of them. Go off and understand, not just in your community, but with use the High Streets Taskforce and the experts, and then put it together and put that into a single vision. Just to if I could just go back to Mark's point, because I think it'll be relevant to a number of listeners to the podcast.
Yeah.
Long-term vision and leadership is the first thing we look for. Now, sometimes people confuse that with a single party leadership. It needn't be that. Actually, some of the best authorities are aware that on the issue of their town centre, they're united, and that you can have certainty that if there's a change in leadership, that actually you've got continuity. So we will always look at council reports. We're not as good as you guys at Place Northwest, but we're not bad. We'll look at council reports, and we'll get a theme. You'll get a theme for how they're written. You'll get a theme for how they are pitched, and then you only have to look at the minutes to see whether they were supported. And I don't mean blindly supported, I mean challenged and then supported, in which case you can have real confidence that you can look at that for the long term. So, sorry, I ended up digressing from your original question, but I think it's an important point to make.
No, it's really interesting and great insight into the research that goes into this process. And it's really interesting as well, because I think from the outside we're under the impression that a council selects a development partner, but it seems like it goes both ways, and you would perhaps veer away from a particular council for a particular reason, if they don't fit the bill in terms of what you're looking for, I suppose.
Great leadership attracts investment. That's a statement of fact. But I don't mean this flippantly, but Dan, what I was going to come back and say to that council is, don't buy it just because it's cheap, because cheap is not a business plan.
Right, going back to the hulking 1970 shopping centre question.
Yeah, exactly. It is. It could be a once in a generation opportunity to buy something at a price which it's never touched before, but it could get worse before it gets better. I mean, Phil touched upon this earlier again. I mean, we're talking long-term projects here. The days of the one-night stand regenerations where you build something and hope that's fixed the town centre, that's no longer the case. It's often a multi-site, multi-year programmatic regeneration you're doing. So if you are getting into bed, public and private sector, you've got to be getting into bed people who share your values and are going to be there to deliver for you that vision over not an 18-month build. It's probably more likely going to be a 5 or 10-year program of regeneration of a town centre.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're rapidly running out of time, and obviously it's such a dense topic. We could probably sit here for the next 3 weeks and talk about it. I want to throw it forward a little bit and ask about future proofing, because obviously there's a big push now to transform town centres to make them relevant to now, but obviously there's got to be an element of making it relevant for the future as well, so that we're not returning in 10, 15 years to rip everything apart and start again. So Phil, how are Muse ensuring that these developments are fit for the future as well as the present?
I think that's a really good question, and there's a couple of responses I'd make. The first is that I'll go back to something I said earlier, that good places are always in a state of flux. They're always changing. It's what makes them vibrant. It's what makes them interesting. So this isn't about, when we talk about once in a generation or whatever, it's not that's more about the kind of scale of it. It's not that will be the end of it. And that's it. Everyone goes off skipping into the sunset and it's job finished, because that's not how they work. However, there's a very good point to how do you make things fit for purpose is a different way of describing it. And I think that's just about getting the basics right. It isn't rocket science, but if you get well lit, really well connected spaces, good connections, both digital and transport. If you get really good quality development that you consider about the long term, not not just the single site, bricks and mortar type regeneration, but the placemaking type regeneration, then you're building in some future proofing, because you're building in value. And value, if people value a place, then they will stay there. It's the kind of short-term piecemeal type development that Mark just described, which is absolutely the wrong way of doing it, which actually will there will never be a period of calm where people go, actually, this is a great place to be.
I mean, what you can obviously do is you can try and build some flexibility into your design. That is going to be helpful. It is going to be more expensive, of course, as well, which needs to be borne in mind. But the very fact that we are going to be bringing alternative uses into places means that they're going to be more resilient. I mean, one of the problems with our town centres is they're pretty fragile. I mean, what you wouldn't ever create anywhere is just one single use dominating an entire place, because if that use becomes undermined, everything shatters. And that's the problem we've got. We've got to build these anti-fragile places, to use Nicholas Taleb's approach, and things are more anti-fragile the more uses you have, because if at the end of the day, home working, we start building some home working places or out of centre working places in our town centre, but it's only 10% of the floor space. If that goes for a burden for whatever reason, that's not going to ruin the town centre. We'll flex and do something else. So, it's that mix that if something does fail, means that you've got a much more anti-fragile and sustainable place over the decades, as opposed to over the next few years.
Fantastic. Mark, Phil, excellent insight into what is probably the hottest topic in property at the moment, town centre regeneration. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Cheers.
Today's episode is sponsored by Muse Developments. With more than 30 years' experience in delivering high-quality places and spaces where people can live, work and relax, Muse Developments is well placed in repurposing areas to bring sustainable, transformational change to towns and cities. For more information, email info@musedevelopments.com or visit www.musedevelopments.com.